Thanks a lot, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Inviting me is a sign of how not very far we are in the science of microdosing, because it's not that I have done that much work yet in microdosing, but we are on our way, and I'll try and show approximately where we are. So we are doing different online surveys, the psychedelic survey, the orange logo out there, and two of the ones we have are the logos sitting there, and we have different collaborators for some of the study, including the Beckley Foundation, supporting the work we are doing with the self-blinding trial that I'll mention and talk a little bit about in the end of the talk. So what is it, and who are the people using it, and where and why and so on? That has already been touched a bit upon during this section. What are the evidence at the moment? Is there any evidence for positive outcomes, benefits, but also potentially for harms? And then I'll show you some preliminary data from surveys. So we don't have any lab-based data, as David in the previous session was showing proper controlled lab-based data. We don't have that yet to show. So a recent commentary on what is microdosing, where are we, and what is the evidence. Sort of the authors we suggested it's not a big surprise that what is microdosing. It seems to refer and contain three components. So that is the use of low dose below perceptual threshold. That can be questioned. But that's at least the main sort of concept for a lot of people. That does not impair normal functioning of the individual. It's a procedure including multiple dosing sessions, which is remarkably different from the full dose that is more standalone, single, a few sessions, as you all know. And a lot of work over the last decade have been done with that model, whereas microdosing is less understood and less investigated. It's also a more new phenomenon. The intention is, when people do it, it's part of the definition of what do we believe that psychedelic microdosing is. It's with the intent to improve well-being or enhance cognitive or emotional processes. That's kind of the definition that came up from part of what was touched upon in that commentary. So as you can see here, this is sort of sign-ups, people participating in fora related to microdosing on Reddit, and you can see it's an explosively popular phenomenon. But does that mean that it's absolutely completely new? Maybe not. There are actually old reports back from the 16th century that people back in the days have sometimes, for medicinal purposes, been using very low doses, just a few mushrooms, to treat different things. So, and also there's also an interview from 1974 where Albert Hofmann also talks about using very, very low doses of LSD, but it's not that there were much data on it. So where do people figure out how to microdose, and how does it spread? And not surprisingly, you probably all know there's obviously, there's a lot of online fora, the websites, there are different organizations producing and publishing their stuff online. There are books, there are news articles, as Dimitris in the first talk today was referring to, tons of them, more and more coming. And again, a sign of how little we know is that a lot of them actually at the moment calls me, and I'm like, there must be somebody who knows more about microdosing. But so we are not very far with the knowledge. People in a recent Dutch survey, half of the people said that they designed their own microdosing schedules. Other people were explaining how they got the information of how to microdose from the internet, not surprisingly, from friends, from books. And I think the books are probably massively underrepresented, because a book like Fadiman's book from 2011, I would think have actually influenced most of the other information. So it's not that relevant to say it's from their own idea, or that is from a friend or the internet. A lot of it actually stems from Fadiman's book originally. And why do people do it? It's already been mentioned, for all these amazing potential effects, better, more energy, well-being, improved cognition, concentration, and so on, stress, creativity, spiritual awareness, a lot of positive things, and including even clinical improvements potentially described in a lot of these anecdotes in the books, on the online fora, and so on, improved symptoms of depression, anxiety in particular. So what are the compounds that people tend to microdose? Again, from the Dutch recent survey, LSD is number one, psilocybin very close to equal it in terms of popularity, 1p LSD in this survey. And this survey was not just Holland, obviously it's an online survey, so it was a global thing. And in that survey, the mean age was 29, so relatively young people, predominantly male, 84% in this survey, and mainly from North America and from Europe. So that's sort of the demographics in that survey, and probably a relatively representable. And then, so back in the days that people microdose, probably not really, there were not a lot, there were 1,000 published papers in the 50s, 60s about psychedelics, not really anything about microdosing, but there's some information that can be useful about finding the threshold. What are the lowest dose of, for instance, LSD that we can perceive? And what you can see from some of these papers is that they found that 10 micrograms seemed not to be possible for people to detect, 20 closer to the border, and 30 people could detect, and 25 they could detect. So around 20 maybe is around the threshold of what people can feel, can perceive. Other ways to try to address, understand a little bit about the doses of the psychedelics, the subjective effects, one thing, but also the actual pharmacology and the how much they actually affect the receptors that are core and key for the effects of psychedelics. That can be done with PET imaging, where you sort of give a radioligand that binds to a specific target, and you can do that for the 2A receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor, with this, which we know already is the key target for psychedelics. We know that the more potently we stimulate that receptor, the more potent a psychedelic it is, and that was confirmed in this PET study where they measure occupancy, sort of the blockade on the receptors of psilocybin. When looking at that curve, so this is the intensity of the y-axis of the effect of the psilocybin, and then the occupancy, so how much of the receptors are affected by the given doses of psilocybin. You can see there is a clear relationship. And interestingly, if you look at, now I don't have a pointer, but in the low range 3 milligram, the red dots, you can see the 3 milligram, which is a little bit more than a typical microdose, because microdose of psilocybin would typically be between, of pure psilocybin, between half and 2 milligrams. So 3 is a little bit above, but nevertheless 3 gives 43% occupancy. That's a lot. That's not a pharmacological microdose. When we talk about pharmacological microdose, we are down in the range with a couple of percent in order not to have an effect of the system that we are looking at. So a psychedelic microdose is more like a maybe mini dose in terms of pharmacology, because these very low doses seem to have a proper impact on the system that we know that they work through. In terms of modern science into microdosing, we had one of them presented in the previous talk, so proper controlled, I don't know if I can use the mouse, can you see this moving around? Not really. So there's a double-blinded, a couple of double-blinded studies. David presented one of them, the last one to the right, was just about the acute effect, so not really any proper microdosing regime. It wasn't sort of long-term multiple doses. Other surveys, studies, they suffer a little bit from the problem that you might just look at people who are microdosing and compare them to people who are not. There's no proper control, it's not randomized. We can't really take any possible expectation / placebo effect into account. But nevertheless, some of the data from some of these studies point in the same direction as some of what we see in the proper full dose psychedelic studies that we have done more controlled in labs. So a lot of the positive things, connectedness that we also see with the full doses, and also some points in the direction of potential effects on creativity, but again, non-controlled data. And then, is it only positive, or does there also seem to be something negative coming out? Because that's important to pay attention to, and particularly in this time where people obviously it's really a trend, people are massively onto it. Silicon Valley are microdosing crazily, and is there anything negatively reported? And actually there is. In the Dutch survey, 20% reported some negative effects, not really very precisely described, but some negative outcomes and effects and sensations that made them either stop or reduce or give it up. And neuroticism, very interestingly, was increased only a tiny bit in one of the recent studies, again, uncontrolled study, but it was a study where they followed people over time who were microdosing, and neuroticism increased a little bit. That's surprising. You would expect that to go down. We see it go down when we treat people with depression with psilocybin full doses. We see neuroticism significantly going down, and typically it is actually very paradoxical in that trial. I wouldn't pay too much attention to it, because in that trial well-being is increased and depression symptoms are going a bit down, and neuroticism normally would be following that, because even though it is a trait, it works a bit as a state. If you treat people with depression, your neuroticism normally goes down. So it's a bit odd, but it's worth noting, because it's a surprise. And here are a couple of examples of people describing some negative outcomes from microdosing. So, a person felt weird or alien to him or herself, or another one described doubt, confusion, uncertainty. So unpleasant effects they report. Another thing, and this is just me being like, whoa, it's crazy, it's really dangerous, but it's important again to think about, and that was also in the Kim Kuiper's commentary that you saw on the first slide, mentioned that agonizing or stimulating the serotonin 2B receptor could in theory be a bit problematic. And when you think about the occupancy that you saw in quite low doses on the 2A receptor, we also expect relatively high occupancy on the 2B, even though we can't measure it with PET in humans. And that means that potentially if you start, instead of taking very rare full doses, you start taking regular doses, that might suddenly start affecting and tapping into some of the processes from the stimulation of such a receptor. And we know that it can cause fibrosis to the heart valves. So that obviously is a concern. That's something that should be probably tested in an animal model, even though it's, I don't know. And then you can also test all positive aspects of it at the same time. And as you can see, MDMA is actually mentioned. That might make some people freak out in the audience, but MDMA also has some potential. There are some bit weak data that it might cause fibrosis to heart valves. And then just because I find it intriguing and confusing, this thing about microdosing, because some of the things that we have seen in our lab, and Leo Roseman, he published this paper from our depression trial, where we can see that the nature, the subjective experience, the nature of it, how much is it a peak experience, how mystical is the experience, does predict the clinical outcome. So the more peaky, the more mystical, the better outcome in the depression trial. And that is not just from that trial, it is in a lot of different trials. Back in the days, and also novel studies seem to be there's something to the subjective experience, and that's why it's such a different paradigm to normal pharmacotherapy, where we give people an SSRI every day for a long time. It's not really about the subjective experience from taking the drug, and that is why psychedelic therapy is really intriguing. But then when you go sub-perceptual and microdosing, what then? I mean, then you take kind of away a lot of that subjective experience, and how would it then work? What is the model? How do we even understand it if it works? Because it's a complete different paradigm then. So in order for us to try to address some of it, we have our wonderful online survey platform that Kenneth, who's in the audience now, has been the master behind setting up a few years ago. So we are doing all these trials. Soon there will be an extra one, a 5 meo one with a nice toad that Kenneth also drew. So there will be an addition to the online service. But as you can see, 2 of them are microdosing, the 2 to the right. And obviously it has a lot of, it's scientific weakness. We are not really in control. We never meet the people. We don't administer the drug. We don't have much control over it. Everybody can kind of sign up. But the beauty of it is that you can get up in numbers. It's much cheaper, it's doable, and we are tapping into real people's real use of drugs in a more naturalistic setting. And furthermore, it's still not completely crappy science because it's actually prospective. We follow people from before, around what they're doing, and afterwards, which is stronger than just asking people more retrospectively and compare it. So when people are their own control over time, it's a bit stronger scientifically. So in terms of the microdosing survey that Laura, a student who have been in our lab from Germany, she's also in the audience, have been sort of managing and running this trial and have analyzed the data, and I'll show some of that. So that trial, people sign up, they consent, they agree that this is their own drug. If they really just really what happened with the self-blinding one, that people saw it somewhere and they went bonkers and signed up and realized we are not sending them the drug, then a lot of them drop out already there and like, damn. But if they actually read it a bit carefully, they'll realize it's people on their own initiative. We are not suggesting anything, we're not pushing them to do it. But if they plan to do it anyway, they might maybe help the science and sign up and fill out all this stuff online. And that's what people consent to. In this case, if they plan to do some microdosing for some weeks, minimum 4 weeks, then they can be part of this study. So we then online have all these assessments, well-being measures, kind of the primary outcome in this trial, and measures of depression, anxiety, personality, different measures. And that's measured at baseline, and it's measured in the end of each week. Online, and also information about what drug did you actually use, what doses was it, how strong did you feel, anything, that kind of ratings we also do along the way on people's sort of way through this trial. And then the sort of main outcomes in the end of it after 4 weeks. So 147 signed up and did the baseline measures. They were 33 years old in average, most men 63, so a little bit more women than in the Dutch survey, and then half of them had previous diagnosis with a mental health disorder, mainly anxiety and depression, so pretty significant amount had some mental health issues, so pointing towards a lot of people are using it to self-medicate and treat some symptoms. And you can see here significant dropout. That's a bit the same thing in all our trials. It is a lot of work to sit and fill out that stuff, and it might have been okay fun to do it the first time, but people maybe lose motivation and drop out of our online surveys. It might be a bit better with the self-blinding because people actually will be, it's a carrot that we can tell them how they performed and whether they actually took a drug or whether they didn't. I'll get back to that in a moment. So the most popular was LSD or 1P-LSD and next psilocybin, so a bit the same as in that other survey I mentioned. And most people had taken psychedelics before, only a few, 13% were psychedelic naive, 40% had were experienced with microdosing on beforehand. They in average used 9 doses over the 4 weeks, in average 2.3 per week, which is pretty average. 2 to 3 dosing days are kind of typical, also according to Fadiman, per week. What doses were they? So they were, and that's very difficult to rate because it's people, then how do they do it? And if they do it with something that's not LSD, how do they make the equivalent? So that is not very precise science, but they were asked to try and rate it, and they rated it up there. So you can see most people were reporting to use small or moderate microdoses, which is sort of then from 6 to 15 microgram of LSD or equivalent. And in terms of drug effects, most of them actually report that they could, and that's maybe a bit surprising and interesting here, they could feel it, or they possible mild effects or definitely some mild effects, or clearly some no effects that they could feel. So they could feel it, most of it, which is a bit surprising. And this we can also pick up when we measure sort of ego dissolution measures or altered state of consciousness scales. We can also see that they score more than 0. Whether that's, since it's not controlled with a placebo, what can you make of it? But people scored something on these scales, so there was possibly a drug effect, and actually also the intensity correlated with the dose that they reported when you averaged it over the whole period. Then what predicts the subjective measures, so these altered states that we pick up with the scales? Expectancy, so having expecting effects was not that surprising, a big predictor of having a significant subjective effect during the period of microdosing, and also absorption predicted, which is in agreement with what has been seen with full doses. Absorption predicts whether you have a strong subjective effect. In terms of the main outcomes, you can see here that this WEMWEB is the well-being measure. At time point 1 at baseline, that was 43, and that increases over the course of the week. Quits, and that is the depression measure, and that's 8.95 at baseline. You can see over there. Now I can't point, but that is in the moderate range. It's actually it's in the mild depression range. So in average, they were mildly depressed, and they were actually close to come up to moderate, because moderate starts from 10 and upwards. And you can see that drops, and that's what you can see here. Then it's normalized to 100%. So, and you can see that the main effects of all these parameters, sort of well-being, depression measures, and anxiety measures, the most thing and the most significant happened in the first period of the microdosing regime. And in terms of whether the subjective experience, the ratings around what they experienced during the microdosing on the drugs, what did any of that predict the change in well-being? And some of it did. So the ego measures, they predicted the change in well-being, and also did percepts of the altered state measure. Other things that changed: resilience, social connectedness, nature relatedness, agreeableness, emotional stability, all significantly increased over the course of the period of microdosing. And experience avoidance went down. What didn't change was 3 of the 5 personality domains, conscientiousness, openness, and extroversion, did not change, whereas agreeableness and emotional stability. And emotional stability is the inverse of neuroticism, so this is the same as neuroticism going down, which you would expect when you decrease, when well-being goes up, depression goes down, then emotional stability follows it. So you can see suggestibility did not significantly change in relation to David's talk just before. And then this is, in the end of each week, people were asked to try to rate some things related to positive and negative mental states relating to the days where they microdosed or where they didn't. And that's again done a bit retrospectively each week, so not super sort of strong science, but as you can see, the positive mental state was higher during dosing days compared to non-dosing days, and negative mental states were lower on dosing days compared to non-dosing days. And then incredibly important, in a non-controlled trial like this, what about expecting the change in well-being? Did that affect it? And it did. So that's a pretty big, I mean, I wouldn't say it's weakness, maybe not very surprising, but the placebo effect is definitely there. Expectation effect is part of it. Is it all of it? We don't know, but it plays a role. And in order to address that, we then need to, this is sort of the summary of all the positive changes, but a limitation is that it's not controlled, there's no placebo involved. And that's why we are not, it's difficult to squeeze this trial in on this hierarchy of scientific evidence, but somewhere there it would probably fit in. But we are trying to do better, so we are trying to do this other trial that might make us a little bit higher in the hierarchy in terms of scientific evidence, and that is by trying to put in the control condition without making it expensive and lab-based. We do the other trial, the self-binding trial, which is ongoing, and we still need people to sign up and participate in. There's a very sort of heavy manual to read in order to participate in that trial, in order to self-blind you with your microdosing, but there's a nice little YouTube video that somebody has made, one of the participants have made, that makes it a bit easier to do it. But basically people put their microdosing into capsules. It can be blotter-based, but you can also do it with plant dried mushroom-based into some a little bit bigger capsules. So people need to buy the capsules and get all these little bags. They need to print out a lot of labels, and then they spend an hour making a puzzle, preparing their own regime, so they can do whatever regime they want over the 4 weeks. They just can never microdose on a Sunday, and they always have to microdose on a Thursday over the 4 weeks. Then they can follow the manual, and then they will end up blinding themselves. They will end up producing 8 envelopes. 4 of them will contain the microdoses. 4 of them will be with only placebo. Then they mix it in a very particular way, and then they end up with 4 envelopes that they will actually use. And a third of the participants we know will then be microdosing with proper microdoses, and a third of them will be placebo for the entire period, and half of them will be sort of half-half during the 4 weeks. And then they put the other 4 envelopes aside and hopefully don't look in them because that would screw up the trial. And then there are barcodes in each envelope that they can scan in on an app, and then we can break the blind. So we know whether people were microdosed, what was in the envelope. We know that from this relatively fancy setup. So that's a very cheap way of hijacking a clinical trial. That is a very expensive thing to do. So obviously it's weak because we don't have control of people's drug. We try to get ethics for people to send the drug to a lab with a code that we can then bring back to their data on the trial, but ethics were like, nah. People can't send Class A drugs with Royal Mail, no matter, even if it's anonymous, that's just very illegal. So we are trying to get some money to do a London area-based version of the trial where we can invite people in and sample the study and also do EEG. So we need a bit of money to do that, but that would improve the science of it. But it's still trying to get up in terms of quality. And this is a bit the same thing as the other one. It's just with the self-blinding involved. So I've already mentioned the pros and cons, basically. Does it work? It seems to work. People are pretty blinded. Of all we know, we have extracted that data. We're not going to show you any real data from the trial yet. End of the year we will stop it and get all the data, but people are only guessing correctly in less than 40% in terms of whether this was whether they're guessing correctly whether it was a microdose. And do we have any data to show? No, I just mentioned it's still open for inclusion, and I mentioned that already. And then I just want to thank the different people involved, in particular Balash, who is behind the idea of the self-blinding. He is a postdoc in New York who we work with, Beckley Foundation, Amanda, they're helping us with that trial. And then Laura did the non-self-blinded version of the microdosing trial. She has done all that work, and then other amazing people involved. So thank you very much.